The world knew Dimebag Darrell as the guitar legend who redefined metal music with Pantera. But in 1985, a small-town Texas jury made a decision that would haunt them for decades. When 17-year-old Diamond Darrell walked onto the stage of the Arlington Guitar Showdown for the third consecutive year, the judges weren't preparing to crown another champion. They were preparing to ban him for life. What happened in those next 20 minutes would become one of the most controversial moments in local music history. A decision so absurd that when the truth finally emerged 15 years later, those same judges would publicly apologize for what they'd done to a teenage boy whose only crime was being impossibly good at what he loved. But before that apology came, before Dimebag Darrell became a household name in the metal world, before Cowboys from Hell changed everything, there was just Darrell Abbott, a kid with a lightning-shaped guitar and a gift that terrified grown men who thought they understood music. The Arlington Guitar Showdown wasn't just another competition. It was the proving ground for Texas musicians, the place where careers were launched and reputations were built. And in 1985, the judges decided they'd rather destroy it than watch Diamond Darrell win again. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, if you're passionate about untold music history and want to discover more hidden stories from the legends who shaped rock and metal, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These stories deserve to be heard, and your support keeps them alive. Arlington, Texas in the early 1980s wasn't Nashville or Los Angeles, but it had something those cities didn't have: a fierce, almost religious dedication to guitar culture. The Arlington Guitar Showdown had been running since 1979, held every summer at the Johnny High Country Music Review venue, a place where Texan pride and musical tradition collided in the best possible way. The competition wasn't some casual weekend event. It was serious business. Categories ranged from classical to blues, country to rock, and the judges were respected musicians themselves, men who'd played on records, toured with known acts, performed on radio shows. When they scored your performance, it meant something. When they declared a winner, careers could change overnight. Darrell Abbott first entered in 1983, just 14 years old, carrying a guitar that seemed too big for his thin frame. His father, Jerry Abbott, was a country music producer who'd worked with some of Texas's finest, and young Darrell had grown up in studios, watching session musicians work their magic. By age 12, Darrell was already outplaying adults at local jam sessions. His older brother Vinny was becoming a formidable drummer, and together they'd formed their first band. But Darrell's real passion wasn't playing in dive bars. It was competition. He wanted to prove himself against the best, wanted validation from people who understood what it took to make a guitar sing. That first competition in 1983, Darrell played Eddie Van Halen's Eruption, a piece so technically demanding that most adult guitarists wouldn't attempt it in front of judges. The performance lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and when Darrell hit the final harmonic, the silence in the venue was absolute. Then the applause came. Not polite acknowledgement, but genuine shock. One judge, a session guitarist named Frank Marino, who'd played on dozens of country records, later admitted he'd felt his stomach drop when he realized a 14-year-old had just played something he himself couldn't replicate. Darrell won first place in the rock category, and the local newspaper ran a small story about the prodigy from Pantego. In 1984, Darrell came back, now 15, and calling himself Diamond Darrell, a stage name that glittered with the confidence only teenage fearlessness could produce. He'd grown his hair long, started wearing bandanas and fingerless gloves, embracing the rock aesthetic with total commitment. This time, he didn't just play Van Halen. He played Randy Rhoads, Ritchie Blackmore, and finished with an original composition that blended classical technique with aggressive rock power. The judges had no choice. Diamond Darrell won again, and this time the crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. Frank Marino, judging again, shook his head and told a fellow judge, "We might as well cancel next year's competition. No one's beating this kid." But instead of canceling, the judges started talking among themselves. What they discussed would set the stage for the most shameful decision in the Arlington Guitar Showdown's history. Because by the time Diamond Darrell showed up in 1985, the judges weren't debating who would win. They were debating whether to let him play at all. The problem wasn't that Darrell Abbott was talented. The problem was that his talent made the competition meaningless. Throughout 1984 and early 1985, the Arlington Guitar Showdown had been losing participants. Musicians who'd planned to enter heard about Diamond Darrell's back-to-back victories and quietly withdrew. Why waste the entry fee and humiliate yourself? The 1983 competition had 47 entrants in the rock category. By 1984, that number had dropped to 31. In early 1985, pre-registration suggested they might have fewer than 20. For a competition that relied on entry fees and audience ticket sales, this was catastrophic. The judges faced a dilemma. The showdown existed to showcase talent, but it also existed to make money and provide opportunities for many musicians, not just one. Frank Marino and his fellow judges, which included a blues guitarist named Coleman Hayes and a classical instructor named Patricia Thornton, held a meeting 6 weeks before the 1985 competition. The minutes from that meeting, discovered years later in the venue's archives, reveal exactly what they discussed. Marino argued that they should create an age category, separating young musicians from adults. Hayes disagreed, saying that would diminish the prestige of winning, that great musicians throughout history had competed regardless of age. Patricia Thornton suggested they could simply ask Darrell not to compete, perhaps offer him a judge's position instead, an honorary role that would acknowledge his skill without letting him dominate the stage. But the venue owner, a businessman named Robert Callahan, had a different opinion. Callahan wasn't a musician. He was worried about money, about keeping the competition viable. His suggestion was more direct. Create a rule that disqualified previous winners from competing more than twice consecutively. A 2-win limit. It was unprecedented in the competition's history, and it was obviously targeted at one person. The judges voted. Marino and Thornton opposed the rule. Hayes abstained. But Callahan held the deciding power as venue owner, and he implemented it anyway. The new rule was announced in the Arlington Daily News on June 3, 1985, buried in a small advertisement for the upcoming showdown. Most people didn't notice it. Darrell Abbott's family didn't see it until 3 days before the competition, when Jerry Abbott called to confirm his son's registration. What happened next depended on who you asked. According to Jerry Abbott's later interviews, he was furious, immediately recognizing the rule as a personal attack on his son. He called the venue, spoke with Callahan, and the conversation became heated. Jerry argued that punishing excellence was un-American, that the competition existed to celebrate the best, not protect mediocrity. Callahan reportedly responded that the competition existed to serve all musicians, not become one teenager's personal showcase. The call ended badly. Jerry told Callahan they'd be attending anyway, rule or no rule. But Darrell himself had a different reaction. At 16, he wasn't thinking about fairness or principles. He was thinking about proving them wrong. about walking into that venue and making them regret their decision so completely that they'd have no choice but to acknowledge they'd made a mistake. Vinnie Paul later recalled his brother's exact words that day. "They think I'm good enough to ban? Then I'm good enough to play anyway." The Abbott brothers had inherited their father's stubbornness, that particularly Texan brand of defiance that sees obstacles not as barriers, but as challenges to overcome. On July 14, 1985, Diamond Darrell walked into the Johnny High Country Music Review venue with his guitar, his father beside him, and his brother carrying his amplifier. The tension was immediate. Frank Marino saw them arrive and approached Jerry Abbott, speaking in low tones near the entrance. Marino explained that he'd voted against the rule, that he personally believed it was wrong, but that Callahan had made the final decision. Darrell couldn't officially compete. His name wouldn't be on the roster. If he played, it would be unofficial. And even if he outperformed everyone, he couldn't win. What Darrell did next would become the stuff of local legend, the kind of story musicians would tell in Texas bars for decades, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, but always preserving the core truth. The kid didn't just play, he declared war. The competition began at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the summer heat making the venue's air conditioning work overtime. 40 people had gathered to watch, a smaller crowd than previous years, and the energy felt off, tentative, like everyone sensed something unusual was about to happen. The rock category came third, after classical and country. By the time the first rock guitarist took the stage, around 3:30, word had spread through the venue that Diamond Darrell was there, sitting in the audience, guitar case at his feet, watching every performance with an intensity that made other competitors nervous. 7 guitarists performed in the official competition. Their skill levels varied wildly. Some were clearly amateurs, enthusiastic but limited. Others showed genuine talent, particularly a guitarist named Marcus Webb, who played a Stevie Ray Vaughan piece with impressive technique. The judges scored each performance on a 10-point scale across 5 categories: technical skill, creativity, stage presence, musicality, and originality. Marcus Webb scored highest with a 38 out of 50, a respectable showing that would have won most years. When the judges announced he'd taken first place in the rock category, the applause was polite, but everyone in the venue knew what came next. Because Darrell Abbott stood up, grabbed his guitar case, and walked toward the stage. The venue went silent. Robert Callahan, watching from the back, immediately moved toward the stage, clearly intending to intervene. But Frank Marino beat him there, stepping to the microphone before Callahan could reach it. What Marino said next showed exactly where his loyalties lay, regardless of what rules had been implemented. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unofficial performance today. Diamond Darrell, 2-time champion of this competition, has been prevented from officially competing due to a new venue policy. But music isn't about policies. It's about talent. So we're going to hear him play, and while his performance won't be officially scored, I think we all know why we're really here." The crowd erupted. Callahan stopped in his tracks, realizing that trying to remove Darrell now would create a scene that would destroy the competition's reputation far more than letting him play. He retreated to the back, arms crossed, face tight with anger. Darrell plugged his guitar into his amplifier, took a moment to tune, and then looked directly at the judges' table. What he played wasn't a cover. It wasn't Eruption or Crazy Train or anything recognizable. It was an original composition, something he'd been working on for months, a piece that would later become part of Pantera's early sound. The performance lasted 7 minutes, far longer than the 5-minute limit set for official competitors. Marino didn't stop him. The piece began with a classical-influenced intro, finger-picked arpeggios that showed his technical foundation, then exploded into aggressive power chords and lightning-fast runs up and down the fretboard. Darrell incorporated techniques most guitarists in that venue had never seen outside of professional concerts. Harmonic squeals, dive bombs with the tremolo bar, two-handed tapping that made the guitar sound like two instruments playing simultaneously. But what separated this performance from mere technical showmanship was the emotion behind it. The anger and defiance channeled through every note. The way Darrell made his guitar scream and weep and rage all at once. When he hit the final chord and let it ring out. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the venue exploded. People weren't just applauding, they were shouting, stamping their feet, demanding recognition of what they'd just witnessed. Frank Marino stood up from the judges' table and started clapping, and Coleman Hayes joined him. Patricia Thornton was visibly emotional, wiping her eyes. Even some of the official competitors were applauding, including Marcus Webb, who later said he felt no shame in acknowledging he'd just witnessed something far beyond his own abilities. But the judges couldn't officially score the performance. The rule was the rule. Callahan made sure of that, approaching the judges' table and reminding them that no score could be entered for an unofficial performance. Marino's response became famous in Arlington music circles. He looked at Callahan and said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Then we'll score it unofficially." He wrote 50-50 on his scorecard, perfect marks across all categories, and held it up for the crowd to see. Hayes and Thornton did the same. The message was clear. The judges believed Diamond Darrell had just delivered a flawless performance, rule be damned. But what happened after the competition ended would prove that sometimes winning isn't enough, and sometimes the people who make the rules have to face consequences they never anticipated. The immediate aftermath of the 1985 Arlington Guitar Showdown was messy. Local musicians split into camps, some supporting the venue's decision to limit Diamond Darrell's dominance, others viewing it as cowardice and an insult to musical excellence. The Arlington Daily News ran an opinion piece about it, interviewing various competitors and audience members. Marcus Webb, who'd officially won first place, said in the interview that he didn't feel like a real champion, that everyone knew who'd played the best that day. Another guitarist, who asked to remain anonymous, argued that the rule was necessary, that competitions existed to give everyone a chance, not to become one person's coronation. For Darrell Abbott, the band became fuel. That summer and fall, he threw himself into his music with renewed intensity, practicing 8 to 10 hours daily, pushing his technique further, developing the style that would eventually define Pantera's sound. The Abbott Brothers Band, then called Pantera, was playing small clubs around Texas, building a local following. The guitar competition controversy actually helped them, giving Darrell a reputation as someone so good he'd been banned, a narrative that made people curious to see him play live. By late 1985, Pantera was drawing decent crowds to venues in Dallas and Fort Worth, and the name Diamond Darrell was becoming recognized beyond just competition circles. But the competition itself was suffering. The 1986 showdown saw a significant drop in both participants and audience attendance. Musicians who'd supported the two-win rule realized it had backfired. Instead of making the competition more accessible, it had made it less prestigious. If Diamond Darrell was too good to compete, what did winning really mean? Were they competing to be the best, or just the best among those allowed to participate? The philosophical question poisoned the event's reputation. By 1987, the rock category had only 12 entrants, and audience attendance had dropped by 40% compared to 1984. Frank Marino quit as a judge after the 1986 competition, publicly stating his disagreement with the venue's policies. In a letter to the Arlington Daily News, published in August 1986, Marino wrote, "I became a judge to celebrate musical excellence, not to protect mediocre performers from being challenged. The decision to ban a two-time champion from competing was cowardice masquerading as fairness, and I want no part of it." The letter caused controversy, with some local musicians defending the venue and others praising Marino's integrity. Robert Callahan, the venue owner, responded with his own statement, arguing that competitions needed rules to remain viable and that no single performer should be allowed to dominate indefinitely. The debate might have continued indefinitely, a minor controversy in Texas music circles, except for one thing. Diamond Darrell became Dimebag Darrell, and Pantera became one of the biggest metal bands in the world. Because when Cowboys from Hell hit in 1990, when Vulgar Display of Power went platinum, when Dimebag Darrell was recognized globally as one of the greatest guitarists in metal history, the judges who'd banned him from a small-town Texas competition suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of musical history. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. In 1990, when Cowboys from Hell was released, local Texas newspapers ran stories about Pantera's success, and several mentioned that guitarist Dimebag Darrell was formerly known as Diamond Darrell, a guitarist who'd dominated local competitions in the mid-1980s. The articles were celebratory, proud that a Texas boy had made it big. But some music fans in Arlington remembered the details, remembered the ban, and they started talking. By 1992, when Vulgar Display of Power was selling hundreds of thousands of copies, when Pantera was touring arenas, when Dimebag was appearing in guitar magazines alongside Eddie Van Halen and Slash, the Arlington Guitar Showdown's decision was being discussed not as reasonable policy, but as the time local judges were so threatened by a teenager's talent that they banned him. Robert Callahan tried to spin the story positively, suggesting in a 1993 interview with a Dallas music magazine that the ban had motivated Darrell to pursue professional music more seriously, that maybe being excluded from local competition had pushed him toward bigger stages. The statement was widely mocked. Musicians who'd been there in 1985 publicly refuted it. Frank Marino gave an interview where he called the attempt at revisionism pathetic and stated clearly, "They didn't ban him to help him. They banned him because his talent made them uncomfortable and hurt their business. Let's be honest about what happened." The competition itself never recovered. By 1995, the rock category had been discontinued entirely due to lack of interest. The Arlington Guitar Showdown continued in classical and country categories for a few more years, but it had lost its prestige, become a minor local event rather than the talent showcase it once was. In 1998, the Johnny High Country Music Review venue closed, and the competition ended permanently. When local newspapers wrote about the venue's closure, almost every article mentioned the Dimebag Darrell story, how the venue had once banned a future legend. But the real reckoning came in 2000, during an interview with Guitar World magazine. Dimebag was asked about his early influences and experiences, and he mentioned the Arlington competition ban. He wasn't angry about it, didn't trash the judges or venue. He just stated the facts. He'd won twice. They'd created a rule to stop him from competing. He'd played anyway and been given perfect unofficial scores, and then he'd moved on. Looking back, Dimebag said in the interview, "Maybe they did me a favor, made me realize I was wasting time trying to prove myself to people who didn't want to see what I could do. Better to find people who did. The interview reached Arlington, Texas. Local musicians read it. People who'd been in the audience that day in 1985 read it. And 3 of the people who read it were the judges who'd been there: Frank Marino, Coleman Hayes, and Patricia Thornton. Marino had already been vocal about his disagreement with the ban, but Hayes and Thornton had stayed silent for 15 years. Now, with Dimebag's interview making waves and the story being discussed nationally, they felt compelled to respond. What they did next was unprecedented in music competition history, an apology that came 15 years too late but still mattered, still meant something to everyone who'd watched that day in 1985 and known they were witnessing an injustice. In October 2000, Coleman Hayes and Patricia Thornton published a joint letter in the Arlington Daily News. The letter was direct, unflinching, and honest in a way public apologies rarely are. They acknowledged that the rule banning previous winners from competing more than twice was created specifically to exclude Darrell Abbott, that it was not a general policy decision, but a targeted response to one teenager's dominance. They admitted they'd voted for the rule under pressure from the venue owner, worried about the competition's financial viability, but acknowledged that this was not an excuse. They had betrayed the fundamental purpose of a music competition: to celebrate the best, not to protect the comfortable. "We were judges at a competition designed to showcase talent," the letter read. "When we encountered talent that exceeded our ability to fairly compete with it, we should have celebrated it, learned from it, been grateful to witness it. Instead, we chose to exclude it. We chose institutional survival over artistic integrity. Darrell Abbott deserved better from us. Music deserved better from us." The letter concluded with a direct apology to Dimebag Darrell, acknowledging that while their decision likely hadn't affected his ultimate success, it had still been wrong, and they wanted to publicly acknowledge that wrongness before more time passed. They couldn't change the past, but they could at least be honest about it. The letter was picked up by music media outlets beyond Arlington. Guitar magazines mentioned it. Local Texas newspapers ran follow-up stories, and Dimebag Darrell himself responded, through his publicist, with a statement that showed exactly the kind of person he was. He thanked the judges for their apology, said he held no grudge, and noted that the experience had taught him something valuable: that real talent finds its audience eventually, regardless of who tries to stop it. "Those judges gave me perfect scores when it didn't count on paper," Dimebag's statement read. "That mattered more than any official win. They knew what they'd heard, and they had the guts to say it out loud." That's what I remember. Frank Marino, who'd already been vocal about his opposition to the ban, reached out to Dimebag directly after the apology letter was published. They spoke on the phone, and Marino later told friends that Dimebag had been genuinely gracious, more interested in talking about guitar techniques and sharing stories than rehashing old controversies. Marino kept that phone call private for years, but after Dimebag's death in 2004, he shared the memory in an interview. "He could have held it against us forever. He had every right. But he just wanted to talk about music. That's all he ever cared about. Playing, sharing, teaching. The competition ban was ancient history to him. He'd moved so far beyond it." The story of Diamond Darrell's ban from the Arlington Guitar Showdown became a cautionary tale in music education circles, a reminder that competitions exist to serve music, not the other way around. When institutions start creating rules to manage talent rather than celebrate it, when they prioritize comfort over excellence, they betray their own purpose. The judges who apologized understood this. By 2000, they'd watched Dimebag Darrell become everything they'd known he would become back in 1985. watched him prove on global stages what they'd seen in a small Texas venue 15 years earlier. But the most powerful part of the story isn't the ban, or even the apology. It's what the ban revealed about talent, about institutions, and about the kinds of people who try to contain greatness versus those who celebrate it. Robert Callahan, the venue owner who'd implemented the two-win rule, never publicly apologized. He died in 2003, a year before Dimebag's death, and as far as anyone knows, he never acknowledged that the decision had been wrong. Perhaps he genuinely believed it was necessary for the competition's survival. Perhaps he simply couldn't admit he'd been wrong. Either way, history rendered its own judgment. When people remember the Arlington Guitar Showdown now, they don't remember the winners in most years. They remember the year a future legend was banned for being too good, and they remember that 3 judges eventually had the courage to say what everyone already knew. The physical venue where it all happened was demolished in 2005 to make way for a shopping center. Nothing remains of the Johnny High Country Music Review except memories and photographs, including one image that music historians treasure. Diamond Darrell on stage in 1985, guitar in hand, playing his unauthorized performance while judges at their table hold up their perfect scorecards in defiant acknowledgement of what they were witnessing. The photograph captured the contradiction perfectly. A teenager banned from competing, judges scoring a performance that wouldn't count, an audience on its feet for a winner who couldn't officially win. It was absurd and beautiful and deeply American. A moment when everyone in the room knew the rules were wrong and chose to ignore them anyway. For those who were there, who watched 16-year-old Darrell Abbott play that 7-minute performance in July 1985, the memory remained vivid decades later. They'd witnessed the birth of something special, seen a moment when raw talent collided with institutional fear and talent won. Every person in that audience knew they were watching someone extraordinary, knew that Diamond Darrell would eventually transcend the small stages and local competitions, knew that someday the world would recognize what Arlington, Texas had tried to contain. And they were right. Dimebag Darrell went on to revolutionize metal guitar, influencing thousands of musicians, inspiring countless fans, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond any competition trophy. The ban from the Arlington Guitar Showdown became a footnote in his story, a minor obstacle on a path that led to greatness. But for the competition itself, for the judges who implemented and enforced the rule, it became the defining moment, the decision that would overshadow everything else they'd accomplished. They'd tried to manage excellence, and instead, they'd created a legend, proving that talent doesn't need permission, doesn't need official recognition, doesn't need anyone's approval to be real, to matter, to change the world. That's what makes the 1985 ban so perfect as a story. It proves what musicians have always known. The best players don't need competitions to validate them. They need audiences to hear them, fellow musicians to respect them, and the courage to keep playing even when institutions say no. Diamond Darrell had all 3 that day in Arlington. He walked into a venue that had banned him, played anyway, received perfect scores from judges who couldn't officially give them, and walked out knowing exactly what he was worth. The competition survived 3 more years before collapsing. Dimebag Darrell survived 19 more years before his tragic death, building a legacy that will outlive every competition, every judge, every institution that ever tried to measure greatness with rules and scorecards. Because greatness doesn't fit on scorecards. It doesn't follow rules. It just plays, and those who recognize it feel privileged to bear witness. That's what happened in Arlington, Texas, on July 14th, 1985. And that's what those judges eventually had the courage to admit, 15 years later, when they looked back and acknowledged the truth. They hadn't banned Diamond Darrell to protect the competition. They'd banned him because watching him play made them realize how extraordinary talent actually looks, and it scared them. But the kid with the lightning guitar didn't need their permission. He never did. He just needed to play, and the world would eventually listen. And listen it did.